OISE. So for Indigenous Education Week this week, that's being celebrated across the University of Toronto, we decided at OISE that we wanted to provide a learning opportunity for our colleagues, for staff, for faculty and students to learn from Rick about the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. And it's good to see you, Jennifer. I'm glad we're all set up. Sorry for the trouble. I'm just jumping in to provide some framing of the talk, and then I'll hand it to you in a second. So why the Dish with One Spoon? Why are we talking about that today? The knowledge that Rick is going to be sharing is incredibly relevant all of the time, but particularly for us at OISE right now, because there's a representation of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum that's been incorporated into the lobby at OISE. And through the support of our CAO, Helen Wang, we have been collaborating with DACIE to the Dean's Advisory Council on Indigenous Education to make this a central focal point of our space at OISE to help guide the work that we do according to the territory that we're on. And so we really encourage you, as you learn from Rick about this wampum, to think about what it means in relation to your work, your learning, no matter what space within OISE you're situated in. And I would like to quickly show you what the lobby looks like, because most of us are from home at this point. I'd love to celebrate the great work that has gone on to make it happen. Thank you, Helen, and to show you what it looks like. So I believe you can see it there. So this is the design that has been created in the lobby, and to the right here, this beautiful representation of the Dish with One Spoon is there to greet you when you enter the space. So this is what we're talking about today. And I will now hand it over to Dr. Brandt, who is a professor in curriculum teaching and learning, to share a little bit more about her perspectives on the importance of this and to introduce Rick Hill. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you, and sincere apologies. I'm not sure what was happening, but I had to log in with my personal email because my U of T wasn't allowing me to join for some reason. I just thought I would begin by sharing a little bit about wampum belts and sort of present this in the way that I present it in my courses. So wampum belts are visual memory keepers and one of the earliest forms of symbolic literature situated within the storytelling practices and knowledge transfer of the Indigenous peoples of the Americas. The communication of ideas and concepts through a wide array of knowledge transfer, such as cane baskets, birch bark scrolls, gourd masks, sand paintings, rock art, are all part of historical and contemporary literary traditions. And in the words of Daniel Heath Justice, they are inclusive of all of the ways we embody stories. Wampum belts specifically mark significant events and codify agreements, such as treaty agreements between Indigenous communities and nations, as well as with the early settlers. These agreements are in place to govern these lands, and it's been told that these agreements are intended to govern the lands as long as the sun rises and sets, the rivers flow, the grass grows, and so newcomers to this land also become treaty people by virtue of these agreements codified in wampum belts. So the design that Lindsay showed in the OISE lobby is a rendition of the Dish with One Spoon wampum. That marks an agreement originally made between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and extended to other communities over time. The wampum depicting a dish with a beaver tail inside models how relationships should be formed and maintained in the lands and waters that include Tkaronto. And of course, Dr. Rick Hill has a lot more to say about the Dish with One Spoon. So it is my honor to introduce Dr. Rick Hill Sr., a Haudenosaunee knowledge keeper from the Tuscarora Nation. I've had the opportunity, along with my children, to sit and listen to Dr. Rick Hill's teachings for many years. And so it is with great honor that I'm introducing him to you all today. Now we go ahead, and with that, I'll pass it over.
Okay, thank you. Well, Chwat Askanahe, that's a Tuscarora greeting that means Chwat Askanahe. I don't know how to translate it other than I wish you well. It's nice that you're joining us here. I can't see all of you, so I'm assuming you're okay, but we'll have to come up with some new expressions for Zoom meetings. I've been fortunate to spend my adult life learning about wampum. When I was a young man, you know, you're eager to change the world, hopefully for the better. We held a meeting at the University of Buffalo, and they kind of passed out assignments. The assignment that I got was to help to recover our wampum belts. Many of them, most of them had been locked up in museum collections at that time. And so I've been doing that, not just by myself, but I'm proud to say that we recovered over 400 different wampum belts that belong to the Haudenosaunee. There are probably another 1,000 that belong to other communities. It's amazing to me, the volume, as Jennifer talked about. It's really like a cultural archive when you think about it. These belts go back to the beginning of time, record our history, our agreements, and it also gives us a sense of the aspirations of our relatives about the future, about what they envision. So I have some images to show you, to talk about it as we go through this, focus on the dish, but also the larger context of wampum. So let me see if I can make this thing work well. So can we all see this image here? Man, these birds. So they say that wampum came to us kind of magically. There's a lot of things in the indigenous world happen. There was this man, his name was Hiawatha. Some people know him as Hiawatha. He was grieving because he had lost several of his daughters due to the sorcery of a man named Tkaronto. This is about 1,000 years ago. And in his grieving, he was stumbling around in the woods. He was quite dejected, as you can imagine. Those of you who suffered the loss of a child know what that's like. Imagine 2 children, 3, 4, 5, maybe even 7. He stumbled onto this lake shore near south of Onondaga, near Syracuse, New York. There were a whole flock of birds on there. They say geese and ducks. He startled them, and when they all took off, they all started flapping their wings at the same time, and they lifted up. They lifted the water with them. On the bed of that lake, he could see these little tiny shiny beads, and he walked out there. He had slowly been trying to recover his mind and thinking about what words he would say to somebody who was suffering the same grief as he did. When he saw those beads, both white and purple, he said, those are what I need to make the words real. So wampum beads actually come from 2 different kinds of clams. You see the one in the upper right, that's quahog clam, see the purple rim on that? And then the one below is a conch shell, a whelk shell. That's where they take the center column. So here's the rub. These come from the Atlantic Ocean. They don't grow in our waters. They grow a little bit along the St. Lawrence, where the St. Lawrence meets the ocean, a little bit where the Hudson River meets the ocean. But so scientifically, and archaeologists kind of disagree with us on that. We just say the magic happened. These beads were brought to us. They're tiny tubular beads. You can see in the old days, they were kind of short and round. As we got metal tools, they became a little longer, and the hole in the middle was a little bit more even. But wampum or shell have been used by Native people for thousands of years. This is one of the oldest wampums that I could find that actually came from a Cayuga site. But notice the beads, it's like if you can imagine a wampum stole that would you hang around your shoulders, thousands and thousands of both purple and white beads. So wampum was used for ornamentation. It was used in ceremonies. It was used to keep track of these agreements. We'll take a look at those. So when Hiawatha was sitting at his campsite and thinking of these words, it'd be like you're driving down a tunnel and you know how the lights go by you. Every time, instead of a light, it would be these words, this sentence. So he said, if I ever found somebody suffering the same kind of grief as I am, excuse me, these are the words I would tell them. And he made strings like this of purple and white. And with each one, there was a message attached to it. And eventually he was able to create this. Now today we call it a condolence, but it really is this uplifting of the mind. Just so happened the peacemaker, the man who was establishing peace among our people, was walking by and he heard Hiawatha saying these words. So then the peacemaker said, well, I'll do that for you. And he picked up these strings and recited that word. So first of all, wipe Hiawatha's eyes, wipe the tears away so that he could see clearly. He pushed back the dark clouds so he could see the sun. The second string, he cleaned out his ears, because think of death as like dust that settles all over your body. It gets in your eyes, gets in your ears, gets in your mouth. And he cleaned out his ears so that he could hear again the sounds of laughter of children and the beautiful sounds of the birds. But he could also hear the compassion that the peacemaker had in the words that he was saying to Haudenosaunee. And then with the third one, he cleaned out his throat to restore his voice and his appetite, and he gave him a cool drink of water. Anyway, there's a whole long procedure there. We still follow that today when we install a chief. It's like the whole family is grieving, and then we use wampum to bring that up. So think of it this way. Each one of those beads and these strings has an amazing power of memory, of words associated with it. So some people would call it a mnemonic device that helps you remember the message there. But it also has power. When the person holds the string, it's as if the beads are vibrating its story to you. And so their words come out of your mouth. And it's a kind of a magical process, but that's the way that it is intended to work. When our Confederacy was formed, then great wampum belts were put together, as this illustration shows, the formation of the Confederacy, the original 5 nations. We are the Haudenosaunee, people who build a longhouse. So the law in that wampum belt is like a house. It's a central fire where the tree is planted. And there's compartments in the house where the Senecas, the Cayugas, the Onondagas, the Oneidas, and the Mohawks were camped out. I'm a Tuscarora. We joined this league in about 1715. We weren't adopted. We were admitted as a full member nation. But anyway, this concept of the law of peace extending, think of it as the rafters of the house help to protect the people. The pine tree that was planted in the center represents peace. And when they assembled our leaders together, they made this circle wampum. These 2 circles on the outside represent the great law, and then the great peace that results from the great law. That also represents that the chiefs and clan mothers are going to stand together. So imagine it like a circle of people with their arms joined together or holding hands. Each one of those strings that hang down represent one of the 50 chiefs' titles. These are the male leaders that we have that are installed in concurrence with our clan mothers. It's a very interesting political system. So the 5 nations are to gather together. Us who are Haudenosaunee, we're born in the center of that circle. All of our culture, our laws, our traditions, our customary practices, all of that's in there. That's our birthright. We can leave the circle, but if we leave, everything that we are born with stays within that circle. So think of it as a protective circle. And the circle wampum we still have today is used when we have our council meetings. And many of the other laws or the traditions of the great law of peace were codified in a series of wampum belts like this one here. Remember that Tkaronto guy I talked about? He was a very evil sorcerer. They used the power of their good minds to transform his thinking and then eventually made him one of those 50 chiefs. This wampum belt tells about Tkaronto's responsibilities to maintain the council fire at Onondaga, to if things get out of hand, he can shut the council down because there's not supposed to be any harsh words. There are 14 Onondaga chiefs that gathered together in the nation. So the wampum belt is it's like our constitution. It lays out what our law is. I said the Tuscaroras joined this confederation in from about 1714 to 1722. Here's 2 wampum belts that are associated with that. And the top one, you see these kind of like steps. They're called rafters. And in the bottom, you can see them as diagonal lines. By bringing people into the Confederacy, it's like we're strengthening the rafters of our house. We're making the roof and the walls even stronger, and shows the unity of our people. So on the top one, then we can see the original 5 rafters of the nations, and then the 6th one becomes the Tuscaroras are added on the far right side. Now notice down in the corner, the lower right corner of the belt on the top, there's a little symbol there. They said at that time that represents the people from the ship who are entering our territory. I'll talk about that in just a minute. So it's interesting to me when the Tuscaroras are admitted, they acknowledge now we have other people who've gathered in our homelands, and we have to think about that. And so the belt on the bottom confirms that when the Tuscaroras entered the Confederation, they added rafters to our longhouse. And then when the chiefs gathered together for the first time, they stood in that circle around the tree of peace. The peacemaker instructed them of what it's going to take to become a good leader. kind of qualities you need, what kind of procedures are going to be involved. And he laid several symbols in front of them. One was the tree itself, the pine tree, the tree of peace, the white roots that go in 4 directions, the eagle on the top to be the guardian of peace. He lit the council fire, the sacred fire. He gave them 5 arrows that are tied together. It represents the unity of their nations. And he also then gave them this wampum belt. And what he said is, now that we're gathered together, now that our minds have been transformed to think about peace, we're going to share a meal from this common dish. And he had this dish of beaver tail stew and 1 wooden spoon, a big round wooden spoon. He says, now all take from this dish. Everybody take some of this dish. So you can imagine this huge dish with this very delicious beaver tail. And then it goes around that whole circle of the chiefs. Each one takes their share. And he said, this kind of represents the way that we're going to be. We're all equal around the dish. We all have a right to take our share. And we have a responsibility back to the dish. Notice the design of the dish itself. It's kind of an unusual design. It's hard to show circles in wampum belts because it's kind of a geometric pattern. This is the closest they could come to it. And they say the white figure represents the beaver tail. I noticed the difference between this, the actual belt, and the one in your lobby. Notice this one only has 6 beads in the center. What's its significance? We don't know, but it's really hard to make a graphic interpretation to make it realistic. Notice the different size of the beads as you go throughout this thing. The belt is really quite amazing. Here's another view of it. So I learned about this belt through digging around in the archives, and I found some interviews that were done by this guy named John Arthur Gibson. He was a Seneca chief from Grand River, and he was the wampum keeper. Imagine he had a whole bag full of wampum belts, maybe 30 or 40 of them. He kept the oral memory of the belt. But remember what I said with the bead? The memory of the dish is within that belt itself. And if you have a good mind, as they say, if you're thinking well, you can call upon the memory of the beads to help you interpret the meaning of this belt. There would be gatherings when then the wampum keeper would pick the belt up and he would recite the story of the belt, and that's where the memory of it was continued. He was interviewed, he was interviewed to explain what the Great Law was in the early 1900s by a guy named J.N.B. Hewitt, who actually turns out to be my great uncle. He was an ethnologist for the Smithsonian. So he's recording what John Arthur Gibson is saying about this belt. We will have 1 dish, which means that we all have equal shares to the game roaming in the hunting lands and the fields, and that everything will become peaceful among all people. Well, let's read through that. What is he saying? So it's true, this original belt came from when the chiefs gathered and they gave them this meal of beaver tail. But then the Great Law was established. It brought an end to warfare among our people. One of the reasons we were fighting was over food. And so everybody's going to share the food. Then once the Confederacy was established, they said, now we need to go make peace with our people living around us. The Haudenosaunee occupied a very unique position in North America, in central New York. There were Anishinaabe and Algonquin people to the east of us. There were Anishinaabe people to the west of us. There were Wendat or Huron people to the north, and Susquehanna and Eries to the south. And since the arrival of the people of the ship, we've had a very tumultuous history. But they say this happened before that we made an agreement within all of our neighbors, neighboring nations, that we're going to take this concept that the peacemaker introduced. We're going to extend the rafters of peace of our longhouse to our neighbors, and we're going to use this as a metaphor. We're going to have 1 dish. Well, what's the 1 dish? It really is the earth and nature. So if we think of our Mother Earth as this huge dish that holds all of these luscious foods, all of the roots, the medicine plants, the water, birds, the animals, all the things that swim, and all of that stuff is held there, including us. We're actually of the dish. And just as animals in the dish that depend on each other, we depend on all of that there. So the concept here is that nature is not meant to be a battleground. It's not meant to be owned by anybody. There's no title to Mother Earth, but that what Mother Earth produces every year is meant to be shared. And so they took this rounded spoon idea to say nobody will use a sharp knife when we're eating, meaning nobody's going to hurt one another over hunting, over gathering living, or collecting medicine, and that we're going to share it together. But they said there's some three very simple rules. One, is you only take what you need right now to fill your hunger, to heal the wounds that you have with medicines. In other words, you don't go and gather and hoard things. So I mean, you'll collect enough for, say to get you through a season if you're collecting medicines, but it isn't like you want to get all of the wild ginger or all of the red willow and just kind of stockpile it and hoard it. You just pick what you need, take. So there's a kind of an environmental ethic. Only take what you need. The second rule, always leave something for the other people who are coming, just as our ancestors left something in the dish for us. What this means is that, say like you're out collecting medicine. There's a certain kind of, let's just say wild ginger. So you're going around, you're looking for it, you're looking for it. You offer tobacco before you even leave to talk to them and say, I'm coming to you because I need you for this thing. Then they reveal themselves to you. But even when they do, you don't pick the first one, because plants are kind of like a family. They live together, you know, there's the old people there, there's the adults there, there's the children there, and there's the roots still growing. And so you acknowledge that. Then you would leave them alone. You'd go to the next one, the next stand you'll find growing. Maybe even a third one. Some people say they go for as far as wait, find the seventh one. Whatever the idea is, you don't take the first one. Same with hunting. You go hunting, you don't kill the first deer that you have an opportunity to. You have to acknowledge that deer and to know that you're going to leave something there for other people who are going to depend on that. So that's, again, an environmental ethic of taking what you need, but respecting the fact that everybody has that. We talk about an equal share of the game. And I think that's important, because what it says is that, although some people say we have an equal right to take animals from the dish. Well, I don't know about right. It's more of a responsibility. It's not, I can't stop you from taking the dish. Now, if you're abusing the animals, if you're taking too much, yes, we might intervene and say, hey, that's enough now. Let's think about what we're doing here. But the animals are created to feed us, to empower us. It's kind of like a spiritual medicine. The crops we grow with spiritual medicine, and then the medicine plants themselves. So that's all part of what's in this great dish. And then at the end it says, and if we do this, everything will become peaceful among our people. Well, if we're not fighting over whose turf is it, we're not fighting over who owns the land, we're not fighting over who owns the deer, as if there's like a Mohawk deer and an Algonquin deer. So we're sharing this. And that when you eat this power food, the power of the animal, the power of the birds, the power of the fish, and the power of the plants, your mind becomes so at rest, the way it's intended to be. Then you can carry on a good, healthy dialogue. You can discuss with others. You can make peace. So eating well, sharing what you eat, all creates this atmosphere in which peace can prevail. So think of it this way. This is what was in place when the Europeans first arrived in the ship. First we met the French, and then we met the Dutch. The French wanted to fight. And when the Dutch came, they wanted to make peace. So we did. We made an agreement with them. And this is the famous Row Wampum. This is the actual wampum belt. It's a little tattered and torn as our relationship with people of the ship happens to be. But it really talks about the ship and a canoe lining up in this river of life. We're flowing down the river of life together. We linked our vessels together. And that if we have peaceful minds, if we use peaceful intent, that we respect everybody, we will have this ongoing friendship. So that was kind of like the nature of the original treaty. The other night we had a discussion about the dish, and the question came, were the Europeans who arrived, did they enter into the dish with one spoon covenant? Or did they enter that treaty? And some people will say no, and some people might say, well, yes, because of our concept. What were we doing here when we made our first treaty? We're extending our rafters of peace to the newcomer to strengthen the house. We made relatives of them. We say from this day forward, you're going to be our little brother because we're going to have to mentor you how to live in this land. Part of the reading of the Turo says that off into the future, one day is going to come when the children of the ship are going to be related to the children of the canoe. Boy, isn't that true today? Because of intermarriage or lust, we have a lot of relationships now between the ship and the canoe. Sometimes it's hard to tell our children apart because they belong to both. So even though they made this agreement that we're going to keep separate but equal, which is kind of a loaded term, it's interesting to me that our ancestors said in this treaty that they would also feed the Dutch if needed. The Dutch asked, if we run out of food, will you help us? Would you use a good mind to always come to us to settle disputes? So it's the same premise as the dish with one spoon. In feeding them our food, teaching them how to cultivate, how to harvest from this land, what medicines to use, they are entering into the dish because in our minds, the minds of my ancestors, everybody is connected to that dish. So there wasn't so much a formal treaty by which the people of the ship entered into the covenant of the dish with one spoon, but the practice was so strong that it continued on. Because if we look at the nature of the Row Wampum, it's important to remember that we have those two lines that everybody understands, the ship and the canoe. And what they said was, and to me, that's what these three outside rows represent. We're going to put our authority, our laws, and our beliefs into our canoe. You're going to put your beliefs, your laws, and your authority into your ship. That's like the cultural independence of each of these vessels. But there's a space in between. And now in the academy, we'd call that the safe space of engagement, where we apply these ideas that there's this friendship and using the good minds will have everlasting peace. But they did tie those two vessels together. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. Yes, we respect our sovereignty, but we're saying we're both here. And in the beginning, they tied the canoe and the ship together with a rope. And then they said, well, you know, that rope's not going to last very long. And then the Dutch people said, well, we have this iron chain. Let's use that chain because that'll last a long time. So we're meant to go down this river together. We're meant to coexist. We're meant to have peacefulness. You can't do that without addressing the matter of the great dish. How are we going to use these resources? But as we know, colonization, in many ways, it kind of upset the dish. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but let me run through a few other principles here. So again, they said that there create this chain between the canoe and the ship, and that the first link will represent our friendship that we have for one another. Second is that if we use our good mind, meaning that we're going to always practice social and political justice, that will allow us then to live in peace. Well, those are three great principles. And that's actually what a lot of the strife we have in our communities and engagement with the outside governments has to deal with, is that we no longer have this friendship. We no longer can employ our good minds. We end up hollering and swearing at each other, sometimes even shooting at each other. So we're never going to have peace. So I think we have to rethink the founding principles of why wampum was created, why the dish was created, and why these treaties were made. Our wampum documents really talk about it's the nature of a relationship. Now you can find treaties, you know, documents written on parchment or paper, and they'll say a lot of great words, but think of this, wampum has the original words, the original intent. The real meaning of that is created in these metaphors. So through time then, hundreds and hundreds of wampum belts were made with a variety of symbols. Sometimes it's still difficult. You can't always read them literally, but we can begin to understand some common language. So look at the one on the top. It's from the McCord Museum. These two hands coming together because they said when the Dutch and the Mohawks first met, they took each other by the hand. Now we don't know exactly, does it mean they shook hands? They embraced their arms together. They locked their arms together. That's an old symbol going back to the Great Law. That's what the chiefs did when they stood in that circle. So something about men in particular holding each other's hands, maybe it makes you vulnerable and connected. Maybe it makes you feel more protected. There's certainly strength in that. So another symbol in the middle, we see this wampum belt that was actually given to John Brandt to say that there's two entities that are now joined together by this central path of peace, or this covenant chain, we could say. And on the bottom, these hexagons begin to appear, and they're kind of a mystery as to why. The hexagon is said to represent a nation, a council fire, and a dish. So in many ways, we saw each of the nations as part of this dish network, joining together, helping one another support the well-being of their people. Look at these wampum belts, a variety of designs. Now, we don't always have a direct translation or interpretation of those designs, because you got to remember, some of these belts, like the one on top, it's still in the British Museum. We haven't had somebody hold the belt in hundreds of years. So its memory is kind of locked in place. But here's the way I view the belt on the top. Because of our treaty language, they talk about the wandering through the woods on the way to the Treaty Council. And you have to pass over these mountains. You got to go through these valleys. You got to ford these streams. Sometimes there's a tree in the path. Sometimes there's a rocky road. There's rocks in the water. So it's an arduous journey to gather together. But remember what I said, we need to satiate our minds and our spirit in order to make peace. Attached to this belt, see that little amulet? Now, the historians called it a turtle, but I really think it's a beaver. Look at the wide tail. Because we entered into the treaty agreements to hunt animals to trade to the people of the ship. That's when the dish starts getting shaky. There's to be some cracks in our resolve to maintain that relationship. And then the whole fur trade really upset the whole dish. And we began to fight one another. So the history books will make it appear that the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people were great enemies. And there was a lot of warfare that took place. A lot of people were harmed, the Wendat, all over this turf. We spilled blood in the dish. And part of our decolonization is that we got to go back and we got to make right the harm that we did to each other by letting greed, guns, and alcohol change our mind, our thinking about the dish. Center belt, that actually comes from, it's in a museum in Paris. It's a very interesting design, kind of a zigzag thing. It's almost as if two rows are becoming interwoven. It's almost like a chain in itself. But unfortunately, we've lost the specific meaning of that belt, and we're still trying to recover that. On the bottom, as the Hurons, the Wendat began to convert to Christianity, they made a number of wampum belts that then they sent back to to France to acknowledge their transformation. As you can see, this one's belt is done to the Virgin Mary. And these belts are just as profound in terms of their message and their meaning as the other belts. So whatever deep beliefs you held, they were eventually codified in these wampum belts. But here's another thing. They said the belts were actually meant to be held like this and read. So the man is holding a belt, he's going down and reciting its message. Halfway through, he turns the belt over and continues on with the rest of the message. So that was a device that was employed and recorded at several treaty councils. So it begins to change the way we think about it. Now it's called a belt because it's, the association with it, it's long and narrow. I think the French called them collars or girdles or a belt. So in our minds, in our English thinking mind, we think belt, we think long and narrow, something tied around something. But if they're really meant to be this memory device that has this story, it kind of changes to me the way that you think about the belt itself. And there are, like I said, hundreds of designs. So look at the one on the top, these octagons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. In likelihood, it was 10 nations that came together at this moment and made this peace or maybe a proposition was made to these 10 nations. So we see the cross doesn't always represent Christianity. It's the fire. Remember the 4 white roots? It's the fire of that nation. The octagon itself represents the territory of the nation or the clan or the village, but it can also represent the dish, which then gets simplified down into the belt in the middle, where they're just squares representing each of those nations. And then on the one at the bottom, it's kind of checkerboard villages or communities. But if you look at how villages transformed from a stockaded wall, like a big oval, to kind of, particularly with the French model of a mission, with the church building in the middle and with all of this a little bit more organized by a European model, maybe that shows the transformation of our villages. These 3 wampum items are very interesting to me because they're meant to be worn. So imagine it's like a, I don't know what you want to call it, it's like a collar. Of course, what we don't know is which way it's meant to hang. So the one on the left. Is that tab with the cross hanging in the front and then the best trail down your back, or is it the other way around? The one on the far right is like a sash, a Wendat sash. It tells the story of that. So you find some very great old photographs of men wearing the belts over their shoulder, or they'll be holding them up like I was telling about, or they can be just laid out for discussion. Just want to continue on a few other things, and we'll talk a bit more about the dish. Just to show you how wampum changed through time. So in 1760, when the British were just about to defeat the French and take over the operation of Canada, they held a meeting with Mohawks from Haudenosaunee near Montreal. Those Mohawks had been allied with the French and had converted to Christianity. But at this meeting, they brought out this wampum belt. They said this belt was made when their settlement was first made. Originally, they say they're probably from Kahnawake, moved there in the 17th century. And this wampum belt becomes their title to their land. We see the cross in the middle. We see probably then the Jesuits are the priests with their arms linked with the native people. And you can see a dog at either end. So they call this the two dog belt because the dogs were guardians of the community. Just to show you another couple more examples of that. Here's one here of a Huron, a Wendat community, which again was also organized around that Catholic faith. So you can see the church on the left. Remember that village checkerboard thing on the right? And then we can see in the center, there's probably like the black robes united together with the native people. When the Kahnawake Mohawks originally moved up there, now you got to remember they're originally from the Mohawk Valley, but they allied with the French and converted to the Catholic religion and moved up to near Montreal. And the Hurons then gave them this wampum belt. Now, unfortunately, this is like the only photograph of the belt. The belt has since disappeared. It was actually stolen from the church that where it used to rest up there, Kahnawake. But it's again this agreement between the nations. They're going to coexist. The top belt in here talks about a boundary between the Mohawks and the Algonquin people to the north. So that series of diamonds that are kind of outlined with the white and purple represents the unity of the people to share this land. And the belt below was one time associated with Tecumseh. You know, scholars are trying to disagree about what it means, but look at the center. What are they? Are they holding a flag? Or is it a tomahawk? Or is it a pipe? So there's great mystery because unfortunately we don't have a whole story on all of these belts. When the British defeated the Dutch, they made this belt, this wampum treaty with us called the Friendship Belt. You can see these two figures, so they're linked together with that wampum that ties our people together. And then down below is another symbol of that. So anyway, the holding of the hands, the uniting of the hands together is important because it shows that respect. So this is just an interpretation of this belt. So the indigenous leaders, in the case of the Haudenosaunee, at one end, hold this belt or this path that goes all the way over to Great Britain, where then our allied, the crown is united together in this. And it has those same principles. But now it says that we have to have respect for each other. And if we have respect, that'll lead to trust. And if we have trust, then we'll have this ongoing friendship. So as a mechanism today, we have to ask ourselves, Is it possible for us to reestablish respect between us and the Canadian government, provincial government? Is it possible for us to trust them after all of these years of not only colonization, but the treaty betrayal, what happened to the Six Nations Trust Fund and the ongoing case of the land in Caledonia? It might not be possible to ever regain that ongoing friendship if we don't have those two things. So I was quite taken though, with what's going on in the States and all this issue about standing or not standing for the American flag at the football games. Why football? But anyway, it becomes a hot point. So here in Cleveland, they decided to show unity by getting the football players to link arms with the police. And so it shows that principle that started with the Great Law around the dish and then with our treaties is still possible. That's still an important way in which we have to show, build our friendship. And I think I'll stop with this slide here. When I was younger, old people used to tell me the story of these old wampums. And every now and then they'd say that when we made our treaty with the people of the ship, we became of one mind, one heart, and one voice. We became relatives. And that we're supposed to love one another. Well, it got me thinking, because certainly in our history, there's not a whole lot of love going on there. With residential schools, with the treaty betrayal, with the smallpox blankets, all this kind of stuff. Well, this was a wampum belt probably made in the mid 19th century. So we see these two figures with their hands joined together. But look at the space created in between them. Remember I talked about a safe space of engagement in the two row? Well, that design becomes like the heart. And that was like the first time it kind of struck me to say, oh, so that's what they're talking about, is building this kind of heartfulness, this kind of one-mindedness. So maybe if we start looking at the dish as our ultimate mother, we have to reestablish, repolish, renew our relationship with our mother, with the earth. And maybe the principles then of the dish, of the concepts that it employs can be used to kind of foster a new dialogue among our people. So I think it's about us thinking personally, what is our relationship to the plants, the animals, the trees. Now, the Haudenosaunee, we're lucky. When we give thanks, when we open a meeting or have a social dance, just like I did with my daughters this morning, because their school is closed, but they still trying to keep up their practice. They go to a Mohawk immersion school, so we're trying to not only teach the Mohawk, but teach them the meaning of this stuff. So when they recited this Thanksgiving, it isn't just like rote memory. It's really about thinking, what is our relationship to the water? What is our relationship to the plants? And so we finished that just in time for me to kind of race up here. But then what I asked them to do, now go outside and clean up the ditch, because a lot of people have littered their garbage on the Mother Earth. And I don't want to say it, they jump to it because it's something that they could actually do that takes that great Mohawk speech and that great Mohawk tradition and put it into a real practice. So we plant, we take them to the garden, we take them to the woods collecting, and so that hopefully we're trying to build that kind of relationship. But here's the big difference. My grandmother, who was a fluent Mohawk speaker from Six Nations, she was going to church. So now my daughters are able to say in Mohawk those planting, or able to sing those planting songs my grandmother never sang. So we're recovering our sense of identity and our strength. And so maybe it's very timely we start talking about our mutual relationship around this dish. So let me stop there and to see what kind of questions or issues that this may have generated, and I'd be glad to continue to talk more about it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Dr. Hill. I wanted to get started by opening the Q&A session with a question. And this comes from the conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago when we were sort of planning for this session. So the Dish with One Spoon and the Row Wampum Treaty hold simple and powerful lessons of good relations and ethics of care. And they provide a lens for teaching about the ethical space of engagement. And I bring that into my own work by aligning that with the Good Mind teachings, which you shared about. I also think that these are particularly profound lessons for OISE as an elite institution of teaching and research. And it's important to consider the responsibilities that we all carry as staff, faculty, and students in a place of knowledge creation. So we have this great privilege to work and teach and learn at OISE. And we have to think about that privilege and what that means within the context of what's happening outside of the building, in a larger society that's characterized by poverty, homelessness, their hungry bellies, there's a lack of clean and safe drinking water, and we have racialized and sexualized violence. So how do we re-examine the bloodshed in the dish through trauma-informed thinking? And you shared a bit about protecting what's inside the dish and examining our relations to one another. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. And I have a second piece, but I'll leave that there and then open up an opportunity for Q&A from audience members as well.
That's a big matter, and I've wrestled with that for a long time. But I think the reason why I presented it the way I did today too is that there's something in what Haudenosaunee had to go through, what the peacemaker did, to uplift his mind, to basically wipe away that grief that he was carrying, that trauma that Hiawatha was carrying. Hiawatha couldn't work towards peace as long as he was burdened by that. So we're going through this great era of decolonization, re-indigenization, great era of healing. But I get the feeling there's great impatience by Canadians. They kind of want to say, well, get over it, let's move on from there. But to realize that that blood has stained the ground so deeply, it's as if we got to create a way of going back to those places or anywhere and humbly trying to wipe that blood away. And I think that's where our tradition, our ceremonies, whenever we had a treaty council, we would also do the same matters, wiping the tears and doing that Hiawatha started. So to me, there's a lesson in there. We start studying the treaty dialogue. I think that'll help you to realize that our people still employed a cultural healing practice even when making treaties, because you can't make a treaty if you come there with a devious mind. So there's something to that healing that needs to take place. We've begun to do that work with some church groups in the Grand River Basin, doing this mutual healing. They've apologized for the conduct, the overzealous conduct of their churches, but we're trying to bring our young people together. So we're not asking people to forsake their beliefs, but to actually manifest their commonality and finding a way to do that, creating a dialogue. So we got to get past our inherited racism on both sides. We got to work through the pain to get to those breakthrough moments where real healing can take place.
Thank you. And so I have one more question, and then if folks can type in the Q&A if you have questions as well. So the second piece is just about the space for all individuals in that dish. And so in my own work on Indigenous maternal pedagogies, I received early on when I started working in Indigenous maternal pedagogies, a little bit of pushback with the word maternal. And so I had to be very articulate about the need to unpack that very word maternal and not think about it from a patriarchal or heteronormative lens, and think about, some of our teachings talk about balance between male and female, right? But I think we're at a point where we need to articulate our teachings in a way that is really open to two-spirit teachings as well. And so I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about where's the space for two-spirit individuals in that dish.
That's another matter that's been on my mind. One time I used to be involved in this program at Attica prison after the big riot in 72 or 73. And there were a number of Native inmates in there who were kind of caught in the middle because it was a Native man who started the riot by killing them. That man was my cousin, John Hill. So there's great tension inside the prison. And then one of the men who headed our group got caught having sex with another inmate. And now in prison, sex is a whole different thing. But our group wanted to oust them because they were very, how do I say it? They were very manly men. And they thought this was kind of conduct went contrary to our tradition. So they asked us to go out and find out what was the tradition on two-spirited people. So we went around and we talked to all kinds of old people asking about this and that, and we got a variety of answers. And some people said, well, we never had that until that was one of the things they imported from the ship. The others said, well, we don't have a word for that, but we do have an expression that he's living like a woman and she's living like a man, because they're obviously acknowledging this. But I have to say, sadly, it's still kind of I don't want to say it's still kind of a taboo topic in our communities. We don't really have a cultural frame of reference because there's not an explicit statement about it in the creation story or in our original instructions. It's not part of our cultural dialogue. Like I say, it's not codified in our language. So it is one of these great mysteries. But the reality is, not only two-spirited people, but when you start thinking of other people of color, where is their role in this matter? The new Canadians who now come from Indigenous cultures from around the world. But I think if we take the principle that we're supposed to love everybody as if they're a member of our family, that everybody has an equal right to take from the dish what they need to be healthy, I think that really talks about our responsibility to help one another with no qualifiers. Now, again, if people are abusing a dish, that's a little bit different, but I think we got to get back to the real old Indigenous notion that all humans are worthy of our respect, that we have to have these trusting relationships, no matter how people express themselves in the world, no matter what language they use or what their belief system is or what their sexual orientation is. They have to find a moment of peace. And the best way to do that, sharing a meal together, right? Because my wife, Chandra Markle, she says that her strategy is the dinner table. Bring together people around the dinner table and this great food, and let the food satiate our minds so that we can then have this respectful conversation. And I think that's really true.
Sorry, I was muted. Getting used to this virtual reality we're in. But I was saying, I also think a lot of there's so much work coming out of the voices of the youth today. And so it also speaks to the importance of really supporting youth and elders gatherings, which is something I think I've seen a lot of when I was younger, and then it seemed to sort of dwindle down, but I'm starting to see more focus on connections between youth and elders through gatherings. So we do have one question here. Individual stated that they once heard you talk about the symbolism of the white lightning whelk and the purple of the quahog relating to different aspects of creation, and was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that today.
Well, you could say in our culture, Haudenosaunee culture, there are certain dichotomies. And one of them is the darkness of trauma and death. That's what Iowantha was suffering from. And then also the lightness of the fire and of the white wampum and the concept of peace and the sunshine. These polarities between dark midnight when there's no moon and then the brightness of the sun. So we transform that into a cultural metaphor. The bright light of understanding, the big fire, and then the white wampum kind of represents that peacefulness, good-mindedness, that which can overcome the other, the dark-mindedness. But those are the only two colors you got to work with to make a design. So generally, when a wampum belt was white in the background, it's talking about a real great thing, good thing. When it's dark, it's talking about darker times. But here's an ironic thing. The French seem to really like purple. So usually when they produced a belt, it was a purple background. That's why a lot of the belts that we see there. So it wasn't like they were trying to send this dark message, but you can imagine if you're sitting there with this cultural dichotomy, and all of a sudden this guy stands up with all these purple belts, you're thinking like, well, no wonder he's dressed in black. But anyway, So trying to turn that around and to say, now it turns out that in nature, the quahog clam, the hard shell clam that closes up tight, only has one natural enemy. No other fish or creature can destroy it. And that natural enemy is the whelk, where the white beads come from. They can come together. The whelk has this powerful tongue lever, is able to break open that shell and then consume the clam itself. So it's interesting to me, in nature, in other words, that makes the white shell overcomes and can defeat that makes the purple shell. I'm not sure our ancestors understood that, but they put this association together with those white and purple beads. But here's another thing. The purple bead was worth twice as much as the white bead because they're rare, they're hard to come by. And there was an atonement for if somebody was to kill a person, they would have to provide so many strings of white wampum in atonement. Let's just say 20 strings. But if that person that he killed was a woman, he would have to provide twice as much. Now, it's not to put a price on the value of life, but it shows how the women's life were meant to be valued, because you kill a woman, you're also then cutting off that possibility of future generations. So wampum was so culturally significant, it could be used even in atonement of murder. Today, I'm not sure, but there's a lesson in that to me about the value of a woman's life within our society.
Okay. And I'm just seeing one other question in here. So what does it look like for someone to embody the dish with one spoon philosophies in their everyday life?
Well, I think the most important thing is to remain connected to that land, to literally walk the land and spend some time humbly on the land, listen to the land. I know I'm an old hippie too, so it sounds a little freaky sometimes, but yes, the trees have life, they vibrate with energy, the plants, the earth, putting your hands in the soil are all part of our healing and connectivity to that. And I believe planting is one of the most proactive things you can do to help promote what's in the dish. Having a kind of conservation ethic, being more aware of where does your garbage go? Why do you produce so much garbage? What can you do to minimize not just your carbon footprint, let's just say your ecological footprint on the land. Now I know that's very different, difficult. I drive, we got 2 cars, we heat with gas, we cook with gas. So I'm constantly stuck with this dilemma, how much is enough? But as you think about it, as you go through your life, you're going to become the planners of the future. You're going to become the teachers of the future. So we have to start changing the way people think about existing on this land. It'll be a slow change, but it's going to be necessary for that. So sometimes it's the simple things you can do. Now, I know it's kind of a joke around my house. I'm always running around, turning out the lights, but I try to explain to kids without oppressing them that all those little things matter. And, we recycle like crazy. We try to keep our garbage down. We try to, whatever food left over, we try to compost that. So it's those little things, those practical things I think that people can do. There once was a little book out, 50 things you could do to save Mother Earth. And you can find a lot of information online. I think it's those kind of little things. But again, maybe now we can gather around us. Once the university opens up again, what can you do to reduce the use of styrofoam on the campus? What can you do about promoting better access to water? Now, there's some big projects that need help. Clean water. As we're working against big corporations, against the government, things like that. So, and there's a lot of Native people who are out there doing things and asking for help. It's just a matter of finding the right connection. But take from what I learned, you can't do it all. And you can't let everything overwhelm you. Pick one thing that you're going to focus in on and make the connections to Indigenous communities and people and offer whatever skills that you have. Don't try to tell people what to do, but work with them to figure out what can be done.
We did have one other question come in. So how would you suggest that we continue learning about this territory and the agreements that were here before us? And how should we approach this learning? And are there other resources you suggest that we learn from?
Well, Alan Corbier, a Anishinaabe historian from York, and I have done several Zooms on this matter. So I would track those down. Alan's written about that. And and there's a lot of information online, I think already. A lot of elders and educators have been interviewed or recorded, and it's just a matter of kind of like studying that. And I then believe, just like this, you could take this conversation, not that it's the end all or whatever, but start an internal conversation, because it's too easy to wait for an old gray-haired native man or a handsome young man, in Alan's case, to come along and to share their wisdom with you and to think, okay, I got it. But you got to start talking about, what does that mean? What can we do without getting, so applying those principles of the two-row and the covenant chain to each other, just to move this forward. I think it's a great strategy for teaching, that it's really helping people with their thinking. And so I encourage you to do more than that, because the other thing too is we're running out of old people. It's just every time I enter a room, it seems like I'm the oldest guy there. So I get nervous sometimes, thinking like, boy, I hope I listened well enough when old people talk to me. I hope I'm trying to share with you the best I can. But think of it this way. Well, old people will say, everything you need to know has been already implanted. It's like the creator's fingerprint. He pushed that into your DNA. And what happens generally in the past, education clouds that, covers it over. It locks it up inside of us. So through quiet contemplation, through great friendships, through the power of a fire, I believe that can come back out. In the cartoons, it used to be a light bulb that goes on over your head. That's implanted knowledge. So in one sense, it's just taking the time to talk respectfully and logically. And then I believe those old Indigenous conclusions will come to the forefront. You'll come to one mind on a matter because it's meant to be.
So we do have one final question that I think will wrap up this session quite well. And this relates to the 1492 land back movement, or land back movements in general. How do these movements fit in the context of dish with one spoon teachings?
Well, you can't have this great philosophy about a dish if you don't have the dish. So we have to find a way to protect those parts of the dish. Now, inevitably, it turns into a fight over who owns title to the land. That's our problem, and getting people to fulfill their responsibility. But I think this is where we all have to take a deep breath, a look in the mirror, and say, how many more toilets do we need to flush in Ontario? How many more $500,000 homes can we afford to build? How many more highways? How many more parking lots? How many more shopping malls? So enough is enough. However, our governments are all about growth because they want more tax dollars, more and more and more. So you have to find a way to engage with the politicians and exert some voice to saying enough is enough. The second is to say we need to share. Canadians have grown quite affluent, quite wealthy in the world. The world looks at Canadian culture as one of its ideals, one of the best places to live. Well, if you're Indigenous, you know the other side of the story. Some of our people live in abject poverty, particularly up north. It's disheartening to realize that. So it goes back to the dish concept, sharing. How can we share the wealth, and not mean that we should all have big homes and vacation in Disney World, but to address the basic needs, having wholesome food, having adequate housing, having traditional health care. So I think the land back movement is important. It's always been important. All my life, I'm 70 years old, my people have been fighting over land, trying to push back on the bulldozer, trying to stop the police, trying to keep it at a minimum. So sometimes I wish I could say we've won a lot of victories, but I think what we're doing now is still raising that consciousness. And it doesn't really matter whether that's that particular piece of land or the rest of the Haldimand Tract, the rest of Ontario, all of Canada, all of North America. We have to think about what is our relationship to the spaces before we destroy the space. My friend Oren Lyon says that this is now the time for value change. We no longer have the luxury of sitting on a yacht, gloating about all that we own, that the environment, particularly global warming, is changing the very nature of the world in which we live. And if we don't change our values, we're not going to survive. So I think that's where this is getting at. Can we stop the police from knocking people on the head? Can we stop the judges from issuing such racist court orders? Can we stop the greed from happening? Well, all I can say is we all have relatives who are involved in that system, and we got to go talk to our relatives. Let's find a way to engage in a different kind of discussion. The academy is the best place to start because, how do you want to say it? You can have a very large free-flowing discussion without the bullets flying. On the other hand, the people who face the police, face the jail, face the irate racism are doing that on our behalf. So we have to support them. If nothing else, they need some money to help build their defense. But we need to get the Canadian government, the provincial government, and the Haudenosaunee, both the traditional chiefs and the elected councils, engaged in finally a fruitful discussion to resolve these matters that have been sitting, percolating for 200 years. Without that, we're never going to find peace.
Thank you. So my course, the students have just finished reading The 4 R's by Kirkness and Barnhart. So I think that's responsibility, relationality, reciprocity, and respect, I think. But you also talked about accountability, right? So I'd add into the 4 R's that accountability piece. But these are really good lessons. And a lot of it is also about that self-reflection, right? So how can we embody the dish with one spoon principles in ourselves? And this conversation, I think, was really about planting seeds for all of the viewers who can now sort of reflect on what that means to them and how they can all bring that back to contribute to the well-being of everyone that calls this land home, of all the people that live within the dish with one spoon territory. So I wanted to thank you so much, Nyawegoa, for sharing your words today. It's such an honor whenever I have the opportunity to listen to you, especially when I can bring my children along with me as well. So thank you. And I am going to pass it over to Lindsay Dupree on behalf of the Indigenous Education Network.
Thanks, Dr. Brandt, and thank you, Dr. Hill. It has been such a great time sitting and visiting with you and everyone who's part of the OISE community who's joined today. I really want to encourage all of us, as you said, Dr. Brandt, to keep thinking about these things. You know, OISE's commitments to Indigenous education and the investments across our OISE community in doing this learning work are continuing to evolve. And I think it's really important that we, start to shift our thinking, particularly around land acknowledgements and our understanding of the place that OISE is situated, and that we're working and learning to think about these philosophies that can guide us beyond surface level recognition. And so on behalf of the Indigenous Education Network, also the Dean's Advisory Council on Indigenous Education, I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their week. Dr. Hill, I hope you enjoyed your time with us today. We wish we were in person, but hopefully we'll continue building this relationship and get you to see the space and the beautiful wampum representation sometime in the future. And for anyone who wants to look back on the recording, the Indigenous Education Network is going to be including the recording on our website and sharing it virtually in other ways as well. So stay tuned for that and feel free to get in touch with us. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Take care.